You too.
How are you?
I'm good.
Congratulations.
I'm so glad you're here. I'm so excited
Me
to be
too.
here.
Thank you.
Yeah, we saw you folks kind of at the
Okay. Yes.
What do you want? You don't mind?
You choose which layer you want.
Could probably clip it to
We
the back.
close the first floor in January and reopen in June. If we live that long. This side. Just when you sit down, if you put it in your lap, the connection is better.
Okay.
I don't get it clipped.
Okay. We're going on up.
Hide this back here, don't let me forget it.
Good evening, welcome. Thank you for joining us for the 13th Annual Sally Lanigan Forum at the Concord Museum. This year we are delighted to welcome Zara Anasanzlin to this year's forum to speak on her new book, The Painter's Fire, A Forgotten History of the Artists Who Championed the American Revolution, along with Erica Hirschler. The late Sally Lanigan was a valued member of the Concord Museum community for over 20 years. Sally devoted herself to bettering the museum, serving as the president of the Guild of Volunteers, member of our Board of Governors, key leader in the museum's garden tour, and family trees display. Sally had a love of decorative arts and material culture, so I can't imagine a better speaker to lead the program we hold in her honor every year than Zara, who is one of the preeminent historians of American material culture. We are deeply grateful for the continued support and commitment of the Lanigan family, not only for this lecture, but our wide series of public programs throughout the year. Our speaker this evening is Zara Anasanzlin, Associate Professor of History and Art History at the University of Delaware. She's the author of the award-winning Portrait of a Woman in Silk, Hidden Histories of the British Atlantic World, and has served as a historical consultant for the Philadelphia Museum of Art, as well as Hamilton, the exhibition. One of the reasons we were keen to have Sarah speak at the Concord Museum this year, besides getting to hear more about her fantastic new book, is that Zara served as one of our academic advisors for the development of our 3 consecutive special exhibitions on the American Revolution that we're organizing for the 250th anniversary of the nation's founding. The second of the exhibitions, Transformed by Revolution, opened this past weekend, and we couldn't wait to show it to Zara. I do hope that you all take some time this fall to come back to the museum and visit the new exhibit. We're so proud of how it came together and grateful for the wonderful advisors like Zara, who supported this major work and made it all possible. Moderating tonight's conversation is Erica Hirschler, the Kroll Senior Curator of American Paintings at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Thank you again for being here, and I hope you enjoy the forum.
Thank you. Delighted to be here, delighted to see all of you. I'm going to take a couple minutes just at the beginning to start with a little bit of context for Zara's wonderful explorations of 3 artists who I had heard of them all. That's good, right? But they're very little known in the story of American art, and Zara's book is really a revelation, and we want to hear all about it. But in order to set the scene for why that is, I wanted to talk a little bit about the ideas of presenting the 18th century. I'm showing you here 2 images of the MFA as it sort of now stands. There are a couple things that have been rearranged. But this is basically the galleries as they opened in 2010 when the American Wing in Boston opened. It's hard to believe that was 15 years ago, especially for those of us like me who worked on that. It seems like just yesterday. The installation was really centered on stories of founders and heroes, people like Paul Revere, who you see here on the left, or Sam Adams, who you see here on the right. These are people that we've heard about ever since we took history class in middle school, and they formed really the heart of that 2010 exhibition. I'm just showing you a couple of the books that are about, again, single figures, figures that we regard as extremely important in the history of the founding of our country. As Allison said, the 250th is next July, and every museum is trying to do something to mark that event in one way or another. And we've been looking at what we've done, looking at the way we've featured these well-known figures, looking at the way that we've also told stories of major events like Washington's crossing, the passage of the Delaware, again, the subject of innumerable books. Or maybe the Battle of Bunker Hill, which we also draw out in our galleries. Images that are so familiar to us that we have come to think that they show us what happened. And I'm slowing down to make that point because these images are actually not what happened. They are confections made by artists for clients, and they do have a point of view. What happens here in this Battle of Bunker Hill, and you can see it's even been the cover of several of the books that address that topic. This is not what happened to Joseph Warren, who was shot in the head, who was shot as the rebel troops were fleeing, who was buried in a mass grave, who was dug up somewhat later and identified by his dental records. It's one of the first times dental the identification of dentistry helped identify a person. And of course, it was made easier by the fact that he had certain silver fillings that were made by none other than Paul Revere. That's not dying gloriously in the arms of your countrymen, looking as if you were in a religious pietà. So this is really not what happened. As we've learned, and continue to learn today, images aren't neutral. They have authors, just as books do. And I'm showing you here Copley, who painted Revere, and Adams, John Trumbull, who painted the death of Warren at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and on the right, Sully, who did that giant Washington crossing the Delaware, Sully's passage of the Delaware. You can see who they are. They're all white men who were painting for specific clients, who were very invested in what stories were selected and how they were told. We are realizing that now, and I am here to tell you, if you haven't already heard it, that we are going to reinstall all of our 18th century galleries, and they will open June 20th next year. You're looking at a very tired curator who will continue to plug away at these 8 spaces that will be reinvented thematically, looking at them differently, trying to look not just at independence, but at interdependence, and about networks of objects and of goods that move not only around the Atlantic rim, as Zara's book so brilliantly shows, but also across the Pacific. And those are the themes that we'll be introducing to you next year. I think we've pretty much felt that Watson and the Shark, that painting by Copley that you see on the screen, is a pretty good message for this new interpretation. It's a painting by an artist raised here in New England, painted in London, showing something that happened in the Caribbean, and in that way, especially with the figure of the man of African descent at the top of the composition, speaks to all of these issues about intersections between people, places, and things. So where did all these new ideas come from? They come from so many new books. So much work has been done, maybe in connection with the 250th, maybe not, but certainly by a lot of different people who have taken on the history of the founding of our nation. And I've just sort of randomly chosen a bunch of books that show you how many there are that address subjects like the history of African Americans in the Revolution as soldiers and in the communities in which they lived, the contributions of women to all of these historical events, not only as supporters, but also as activists and writers, and also the effect and participation of indigenous nations in these battles. So these ideas are all coming from new scholarship by both academic and non-academic writers, tremendously interesting to expand our understanding of what happened in these critical years. I think Zara's book stands as one of these transformational books. It's about three painters, well, two painters and a sculptor, who really invested not only in the art they made, but in the politics and communities around them. And I'm going to hand this over to Zara, who's going to tell us who these three folks are, and then we'll have a discussion.
Thank you so much. And I have to say, I'm usually a soprano and I'm a baritone today because, because I had a cold last week and it went away, but it took my voice with it, which is so frustrating because I've been so looking forward to this conversation with Erica, whose work I so admire. And I have to say, I don't think historians say it enough, but we could not do object-based history without the work the curators and other museum staff do. So thank you for all of that. And it's such a pleasure to be back here at the Concord Museum. You have an amazing staff, and I was so honored to work on your series of exhibitions leading up to commemorating the 250th next year. And as I was telling David earlier when I was seeing the latest show, it's amazing to me that no matter what the topic is, you can find something in Concord that speaks to it, which is so fabulous. So I'm really excited to be here tonight, and I promise you, I feel great. My voice sounds terrible, but apologies for that. If you ever hear me in another talk, you'll be like, she doesn't sound like a man in this one. But so I like to start with actually talking about my book cover. So I like that Erica ended with that because the title is very evocative. It is based on a Phyllis Wheatley poem to SM, a young African artist, on first seeing his works, in which she says something about the painter's and the poet's fire being something that keeps creative vision alive. And when I think about what motivates people to fight any revolution, any protest, but including the American Revolution, you think you have to, it's not like it's a purely upward trajectory all the time. You need to figure out what inspires you to keep the fight going, what inspires you to pick up the musket in the first place and to keep going, what inspires you to, be Abigail Adams manning the farmstead while John is away. And I think that oftentimes creative people provide the things that inspire us. They provide the poems and the music and the art that keeps us going. And so the title, The Painter's Fire, is an homage to the creative people in any political protest and war and revolution who really make a political statement of importance and keep ordinary people invested in the fight, but also speaks in particular to exactly what Erica was alluding to, that we know very well the story of the elite, mostly elite white men who are such important figures in our revolutionary past, and rightly so. They're amazing, inspiring figures, but they're not the only ones who are part of this story. And so bringing people like Phyllis Wheatley into this story, I think, reminds us that this is a revolution that is peopled by a wide range of people, women and men, children as well as adults, people on the other side of the Atlantic as well as here in North America, and people of color as well as white descent. So I wanted to start with that. But the other reason I like to talk about it is that there are very few things my children think I do that are even remotely cool, because I'm kind of professionally a nerd. And the one thing they think is cool is that I consulted on this Hamilton the exhibition. But so because they are so resolute in their thoughts that I am very uncool, I try to go out of my way if they do have to see me in a professional setting to embarrass them. It's kind of one of my hobbies. And so I was so delighted when this cover came up because they're both Gen Z. And so every time I get to talk about this, and I got to experience this, my daughter was at a talk I gave at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and I got to see its direct effect on her. I was like, I love this cover because it's so fire. And my children are just so embarrassed by this, and I saw my daughter just blush and want to melt into the ground. So it's a wonderful cover to begin with because I think it speaks to mostly the inspirational story behind the title, but also allows me to poke fun at my children, which is great. But so the three central characters in here, the first one is Prince Dima, who at one point was known as Prince Dima Barnes because his enslavers were the two people you see here, Christian on the left and Henry Barnes on the right. Now, Prince Dima is remarkable because he's the first identifiable enslaved portrait painter in North America. And as many of you probably know, so many portraits from colonial America aren't identifiable at all. So that's why in museums they'll say things like portrait of a woman or, so-and-so by anonymous. So the fact that we know his identity and we know a few of paintings that he painted is remarkable. And his story is remarkable too, because he was born into slavery to a mother who was from Africa, stolen from Africa as a young girl, like Phyllis Wheatley, brought to Massachusetts and enslaved by Henry Barnes. At some point, she gave birth to her son, Prince Dima, as she called him, which is very unusual because most enslaved people are not given double names. They're just given one name. And as time would later tell, Dima was a name that they, mother and son, once free, took as their surname. And so that means it was either her surname in West Africa, it is a West African surname, or it was her name as a girl before she was renamed Daphne by her enslavers. Because Daphne is a Muslim girl's name. We don't know which one of these it is, but what we do know is that she was determined to hold on to her African heritage and to pass it on to her son. And I mention this because we also know from correspondence that Christian Barnes writes that Daphne needles her. She, cajoles and charms alternately to ask Christian Barnes to buy her son back. He'd been sold away from her as a young boy, probably to Christian Barnes's brother, and he'd been working as a mariner for many years. But he was a really talented artist. And Christian Barnes was not satisfied with her lot in life. She wanted to do more. She was sort of like Abigail Adams saying, "Remember the ladies." She wanted to do more with her life than just domestic pursuits. And so Daphne said, "My son is a really talented artist. Look at this portrait he did." And he did a portrait of Christian. She was impressed. She bought him back, and she decided to become his art patron. Now, this is highly unusual. There are many creative, fabulously talented enslaved people in New England as elsewhere who are working in professional artisanal capacities. But it's very rare that a white enslaver would want to be a sort of art patron. That's a very different matter. Most colonial American artists are not sent to London to train, as she eventually has Prince Dima do. People like Charles Wilson Peale, for example, it's a group of gentlemen who come together in Maryland and decide to send him there. This is not a usual thing. But so she and Henry decide they're going to take Prince Dima to London to have him trained, and they do. When he comes back, he sets up shop as a professional portrait painter in Boston, working out of a as time would tell, patriot watchmaker John McLean's shop. And while there, he did portraits like this, which is of Scottish merchant William Dogood. And the thing that I love about this portrait, which is hanging in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, is that I think it shows Prince Dima's, even though to your eyes it probably looks very folksy, especially compared to the wonderful classically trained paintings that Erica started us out with. But if I can unpack it for you a little bit symbolically, I think it speaks to Prince's sophistication as an artist post-London training. Because William Dogood is a Scottish merchant. He's wearing the brooch that you see on the right. The brooch actually descended in the family, which to me means they cherished the brooch and the painting. It is a symbol of love and affection. It's shaped like a heart. It's made of garnets. Garnets are a symbol of love and affection as well. But it's also a symbol of Scottishness. So it's what's called a witch's heart or a Lucan booth. So it's saying this is a Scottish man. There are books in the background saying this is a learned Scottish man. And then he's wearing a dressing gown or a banyan that's made out of cloth that's probably from India. And he is a merchant. So it's saying here's a Scottish merchant in a colonial city asserting his Scottish heritage, his global trade connections, and his erudition. So the fact that this formerly enslaved man knew all of these symbols, I think, is testimony to his sophistication as an artist. One of the things I love is that he does sign the back of this portrait. And if you look closely, you'll see it's a very large Prince, a very large Dima, and a teeny tiny Barnes. And in fact, what happens is when his loyalist enslavers, I'll just go back to them for 1 second, when they flee for England in 1775, because among other things, a horse is tarred and feathered in their name, and I'd be happy to go into that in more detail in our conversation. Their house is taken over by the Patriots, given to the use of General Henry Knox and his wife Lucy. The gashes you see in their chests are from bayonets that Patriot soldiers put through the heart of the paintings when they commandeered the house. Prince stays behind, and he not only stays behind, along with his mother Daphne, he enlists to fight for the Patriots in a famous artillery unit called the Train, of which Paul Revere is the second in command. And so I think it's a wonderful tale of the fact that this is a man who probably would have been better off going to the British, because more black men gained their freedom through the British than they did through the Americans. But I think he enlists to fight for the patriot cause because he's inspired about the ideals of liberty. And one of the reasons I think that is that his teacher was a man called Robert Edge Pine in London, and I'll get to him in a minute. Robert Edge Pine in London was connected with this woman, Patience Wright, who is an American wax sculptor and kind of a painter because they paint the features of the wax figures once they make them. She's famous in London as the revolution breaks out because she is very pro-American. She operates a wax museum, which is sort of like Madame Tussauds before Madame Tussauds. And she's infamous for the method in which she supposedly created her wax pets. She would apparently make them from life, and she would look at you very intently, and she had these piercing eyes. And she would look at you and have conversation and model the figure under the skirt and then whip it out fully formed in what was obviously a sort of sexually titillating activity, but also astonished onlookers because it was so realistic. And I think you can see a hint of the realism in her one surviving full-length wax figure there on the right, which is at Westminster Abbey, which is of William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham, who famously, in part because of a Copley painting, famously collapsed and died on the House of Lords floor after giving an impassioned, somewhat pro-American speech. Americans think he's more pro-American than he actually is. But, and there you see, she was commissioned to make this wax figure to celebrate him after his death. He's wearing the robes in which he actually collapsed and died. And she is part of this connected group with Prince Dima because she is connected professionally and socially to Robert Edge Pine, who is the man who gives him professional training in London. She's also a spy during the American Revolution, which we can go into during the Q&A. There's her portrait by Robert Edge Pine on the right. And one of the things I love about this portrait, which is in the National Portrait Gallery in DC, is I think he's captured sort of her defiance. This was painted in 1780-ish, 82 probably. And I also love that under the diaphanous fold of cloth, you know, there seems to be some sort of figure. So I think he's hinting at her at her very charismatic and celebrated way of making figures under her skirts. And then on the left, you see a portrait of George Washington by Robert Edge Pine, because Robert Edge Pine, although he is a British artist born in Britain, award-winning, he was one of the key, he was an elected officer in the Society of Artists, which is sort of the precursor to the Royal Academy of Art. His father was a person who held royal appointments to George II. They're a very well-connected set of artists, likely of African descent, which is something we can go into in the Q&A as well. But because he is so inspired by the American cause, particularly the ideals of liberty and trying to seek liberty and its expansiveness around the globe, after the war, he decides to relocate to America, where he paints this portrait of George Washington, among other things. And people at the time have said that this portrait of Washington, as well as the portrait that Patience Wright's son, Joseph, does of George Washington, are some of the best likenesses of him. Now, this probably doesn't look like the George Washington you picture, because to Erica's point, this is not heroic George Washington. This is kind of tired and old, I need to put my glasses on because my eyes have grown old in the service of my country, George Washington, which I think is a really interesting statement, because this is not the George Washington of marble that we're used to seeing. This is, I think, George Washington, the man who's kind of really tired after fighting many years of war on behalf of his countrymen. So Robert Edge Pine, when he comes to America, one of the things he wants to do is paint all these amazing paintings that commemorate things like the Battle of Bunker Hill and the signing of the Declaration of Independence, etc. People at the time are so taken by him because he is by far the most important artist who's come to set up residence in America. There's never been an award-winning British artist who's relocated to America to set up painting American scenes at this point in time. Robert Morris, the famous financier of the American Revolution, is so taken by him that he builds a bespoke mansion for him in Philadelphia. The entire second floor is a gallery. This is the first grand art museum in Philadelphia, and apologies to Charles Wilson Peale, this is true. And in fact, Charles Wilson Peale's, one of his 85 sons who comes to see it, says how astonished he is compared to his father's little museum, which at the time is running out of a few rooms of their house. So Robert Edge Pine dies of one of the classic 18th century diseases, apoplexy, before he can finish his paintings. And then sadly, they, in a weird twist of fate, go up in smoke along with most of Patience Wright's wax figures. But one of them that survives is this one on the left, which is Congress voting independence. And if you look at it, you'll see that these are not heroicized men. These are not men in the sort of, celebrated, like there's no one in a pietà kind of, classically posed thing here. These are very real figures. Some of them have a little paunch, they're balding. This also is a very accurate depiction of the inside of Independence Hall. The architecture is very precise. They're sitting in Windsor chairs, just as they did at the time. There are blinds on the windows. The ceilings aren't too high. By contrast, when John Trumbull comes in later and is inspired by Robert Edge Pine's painting of the same scene, he does a very different thing. The ceilings have been raised quite a bit. There are velvet swags at the windows. Everyone has a very well-turned calf. No paunchy bellies here. There are fabulous carpets on the floor. And in short, what he's done is glamorized and romanticized this scene. So I'm not saying anything against John Trumbull. I think his work is amazing. I love him. I love Copley. I love Peale. However, I think thinking about the revolution we might have in terms of a visual effect, had these other artists who are lesser known, who are artists who are women and men of color, I just like to think about what we might think the revolution actually looked like had more of their art survived.
Thank you. It's such an impressive achievement to reconstruct these three figures who really are fairly not known, except for the few works that are in museums collections. What I wanted to ask you was, how on earth did you get inspired to pick these three people? Because, as you say, there are many untold stories that we have yet to discover. What set you off on this particular cast of characters?
Yeah, so I always say that at this point I'm a one-trick pony. I'm someone who goes to a museum and sees a painting and I'm like, oh, that could be a good book. And that's exactly what happened here. I went to see the Prince Dima painting at the Met, and I looked at the label, and it was very much at the time defining him as an enslaved person, which is part of the remarkableness of his story, but to me does him injustice, because I don't think that should define his story. And realizing that he was trained in London, which is astonishing, and that suddenly I had this London connection, I thought I could do something about Robert Edgepine and Prince Dima. But I always want to include women, because women are half of history, but we're not always half of history. And when I figured out that Patience Wright, who is this larger-than-life character, engaging in maybe inefficient espionage, at some point her letters are stopped by the sort of British version of MI6 in the 18th century, and they're like, it's another letter to Franklin. It's not that great. We're going to let it go through because her information, it might do us more good than harm, because it's not good information. But the fact that you have this American woman who is risking, at the very least, imprisonment for the duration of the war, and knowing that she's connected to Robert Edgepine's family in all of these ways, I thought, here's a chance to tell a story of these American patriots who are operating in the heart of enemy territory, as it were, and whose art, as well as history, has been sort of neglected in the stories that we tell.
Thank you. So you embarked on this, what could have been a really dead-end project, right? You get very excited about something, nobody's written about it before, there's a little bit of evidence in the form of a piece of artwork or inscriptions, maybe some newspaper names that show up. Thank God for, digital newspapers, is all I have to say. What was your most exciting find in terms of writing this history?
I think one of the things that most excited me was how much art you can find in the archives that no longer exists. And sounds very contradictory, because I just said this book was inspired by looking at a painting which is on display at the Met, right? So very much the antithesis of this. But recognizing that there is so much art that was created that we no longer have. And yet we can reconstruct it through archival sources. And this was the story that, it is what opens the book. And to me it was very astonishing, because, I'll set the stage a little bit, it's 1780, so 5 years after the Battle of Lexington and Concord kicks off the Revolution, right? 5 years into the war, it's the opening annual exhibition at the Royal Academy of Art. They have this brand new building that the King and Queen have donated their largesse to have built. Huge open gallery space. There are 500 plus paintings on display, 38 tall ceilings sort of crammed in. To get a painting into the show, you have to pass a jury selection. So you can't just say, I want to hang my painting at the Royal Academy, right? They have to choose it. All this background is to say that very few of the paintings are remarked upon, right? Benjamin West's new portraits of the King and Queen are there. They're remarked upon. There are a couple of amazing, now known to us, well-known paintings that are remarked upon. But there's one painting that is always discussed that is by Patience Wright's son, Joseph. He's one of the first Americans to train at the Royal Academy of Art. He's 22 years old, and it's his debut entry. And it's remarked upon by a number of sources, newspapers as well as private letters. It's a portrait of his mother, who I already explained to you is famous, right? And it showed her much as the image of her that I showed you with the head on her lap. And it's just called Mrs. Wright modeling a wax head. But the wax head is the decapitated head of King Charles I. And looking down are busts of King George and Queen Charlotte, who of course are physically themselves at the exhibition and undoubtedly saw this. But what I thought was amazing was this got past a jury and was hung on the walls, right? And they knew the King and Queen were going to be there. Not only that, but of course people write about it in newspapers and private letters, and they're like, what were they thinking? This is treasonous, this is terrible. But other people are like, what an entertaining defense of constitutional liberties. And a reminder that our American brethren are the true defenders of English constitutional liberties. And I just thought, how astounding that it's 5 years into the war and this is the Royal Academy and the King and Queen are there. And There is a Treason Act in place, mind you, specifically related to pro-American activities. And yet this happens, and not everyone is anti this portrait. And then the backstory to why the portrait no longer exists is that Joseph Wright, for obvious reasons, sort of persona non grata in, royalist London, goes to France, where the Wright's family friend Benjamin Franklin takes him under his wing. Among other things, he updates the Duplessis portrait, which is upstairs, in his own sort of copy. And Franklin arranges him to have transport across the Atlantic because he's gotten this exciting commission to make a facial mold of George Washington that will then be sent to England to make a statue that they want to commemorate. So very exciting commission for this, 23-year-old guy. So he sets sail with his paintings, and 10-week journey right off the coast of Maine. They're supposed to land in Boston. Snowy weather, and the ship, which is called the Argo, crashes into the rocks. And the passengers manage to make it ashore, but the cargo is washed out. And so these paintings are lost under the Atlantic. But so, to me, that's a remarkable reminder that there's so much art that does not survive. But also, to me, it was sort of a metaphor for the rest of the book that just because a shipwreck happened, the things don't disappear, they're just underwater, right? So if we can bring them up from underwater, we can see them. And so I'm like, why can't we bring these hidden histories up into the light from the depths? And so to me, that was one of the most exciting things, because I'm there in the library at the Royal Academy Archives, and I'm like, I can't believe this portrait actually existed and that it hung on the walls of Royal Academy. And then I was really sad that it doesn't exist anymore.
So now I'm going to ask you a question that I was going to sort of hold to the end because it's a little more existential. But now that you've talked about paintings that don't exist, physically anyway, they're descriptions and records, but we don't have them. How does a museum, a historical society, et cetera, curate absence? Things that aren't in your own collection. For example, that beautiful painting is at the Met, not at the MFA, so we don't have it. The object didn't survive, it's at the bottom of the Atlantic.
Right.
Or that never existed. The great, trained painter, the equivalent of Copley, who was indigenous, for example. Not something that happened in an indigenous art tradition, so there's not going to be an oil painting that you can put up as an equivalent to the Copley. So thinking sort of existentially, and you're able to do things in books that words can paint, but you can't see them except in your imagination. So how shall we expand our stories with things that we can't see?
I love an existential question. So that's fun to start. And I will say, I mentioned earlier that I tend to find inspiration from going to museums and looking at paintings. And my next project is actually inspired by going to a museum and looking at an empty frame. So
Where'd you see that?
yes, so this gets at the existential question. So at the Nantucket Whaling Museum, they have a marvelous exhibition of portraits of people who are important in Nantucket history. And one of the things that they've done, which I find really striking and inspiring, is you go from sort of portrait to portrait, and then there's an empty frame. And at first I was like, oh, is this like, Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum tactic, which I also think is inspiring and amazing that those empty frames are still there. But no, it's actually, if you read the label, it says something like, here's where the indigenous leaders who lived on this island before it was colonized by Europeans, this is where their images should be, but we don't have them. And then it would be, further on into the 19th century, here's where we should have an image of this person who was, so famous in, standing for religious liberty or something, but we don't have a portrait of them. And so they do this in multiple times throughout and it sort of starts with, prehistoric, so to speak, Nantucket and goes up until not quite the present day, but into the 20th century. And they do it more than once, and they do it to make a very, very pointed statement about whose images we have and why, and whose images we don't have and why. And to me, I thought that was so striking and such a simple yet effective way to make people stop to think about, in this case, not what's been lost, but what was never created in the first place, which is an entirely different story. And so I think that's one way we can do it. I think that we can actually point out absences in a visual way, and I think that can be very effective. I mean, it's probably, I used to work in museums. It's also a really inexpensive way to do it, which is nice. You know, if you have an empty vitrine or, you know, an empty frame, it's not going to cost as much for the art handler to put it together, for example. But I think that's one way you can do it. And I think another way to do it is I hope that more historians and art historians take seriously wrestling with objects that no longer exist, and realizing that we don't have to fetishize things that still exist as the full story of our visual or material past. And while there is certainly nothing like analyzing, you know, the extant object or image, and I was trained at the Winterthur Museum, so those of you who know it's you're taught to look and measure and do all the things. But I think it's also important to recognize that if we need to think about material and visual culture the same way we think about, you know, things and art, the same way we think about archives and documents. We've since come to recognize that we need to think about whose voices are not present in the archives, whose letters weren't saved, whose names are subsumed under their husbands, for example, even enslaved people who were illiterate and so could not keep a diary. But I think in the same way we need to think about art and objects, that they also reflect absences of the indigenous artist who didn't get to go to London to train, or, you know, the woman who you know, was not able to, like Patience Wright, she's very odd that she is a professional sculptor who, you know, wanted to sculpt but couldn't, or the enslaved man who would have loved to have gone to London to train but didn't have the chance. So to me, the existential question to wrestle with is, and this is why I love doing forgotten histories and hidden histories, even though they're a lot more detective work, but I feel like I want to do justice to the people in the past whose, just because their stories aren't as easy to excavate doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask a sort of follow-up question, which I found beautifully phrased, I guess I would say, in your book, which is, you do have passages in your book where you have filled in some blanks. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the relationship that you've made as a writer between what you've gleaned from the incredible archival work that you've done and that research, with also sort of making people want to get to know these people by setting them in a place, in a room with a fire, or...
Yeah, I think it's such a good point to bring up, because we all live in a material world, right? And I think if someone were to write a biography of any one of you, to just base it on whatever emails you sent or letters you sent would not do justice to probably the fact that I'm sure all of you have possessions in your home that mean something to you, and where you live matters to you, and whether or not you identify as a New Englander matters to you. And so to me, placing these people also in their material worlds and their spatial realities, I think really helps. And for example, thinking about what it would have been like for Prince Dima, who had been a mariner, so he'd been well-traveled, but, you know, well-traveled on a ship is different than well-traveled getting to, you know, spend time offshore training as an artist. But the fact that when he leaves for London, he's one of only 5 enslaved people in Marlborough, Massachusetts. And then he ends up training in St. Martin's Lane, which is the heart of the British art scene in the entire British Empire. It's where Thomas Chippendale has his shop. It's where, you know, you have printmakers and booksellers. And to think of what it would have been like for this man who'd been enslaved in Massachusetts to suddenly find himself in the center of what was, the throbbing metropole of the British Empire. It must have been completely amazing and transformative. And the same thing happens to Phyllis Wheatley. And we know from her letters that she writes about it that it was amazing and transformative. And that she did go to these museums that boggled her mind, right? And she went to the Tower of London and saw the menagerie of, exotic creatures there. And, to think about what it meant for people, what their home was like, but also what it meant when they, as the characters in this book do, roam around the Atlantic world. So these are not people who stay put, right? These are people who are cosmopolitan in the sense that the 18th century thought of cosmopolitan, meaning you're well-traveled, you are exposed to a lot of different people and places. And to think about it as, these are not provincial people, even if they come from provincial places. And I think that colors their worldview. And so to me, setting them within their spatial reality is part of it. And again, I think that paying careful attention to the material world reminds us, and I think actually the last installation of your exhibition here, Whose Revolution, did a wonderful job with this, where you had the silhouettes of, enslaved people in the room. Just a reminder that they're present, that even though the focus might be from a decorative arts perspective on the wonderful William and Mary style furniture, for example, that what you really want to do is remind people that there are people of African descent interacting with that furniture as well. And so to me, that's what I want to do as a writer too. And I think that if we can do that, we remind people that, to me, it's so much more interesting to tell the richer story with a diverse cast of characters than to think of the world as this very starkly divided. You had the wealthy white people and then you had everyone else, when in fact it's much more diverse, and I think possessions and belongings show you that.
That's great. I'm going to ask you one more question, then I'm going to open it up to all of you. So you have, 2 minutes to try and think of your most compelling questions. I wanted to ask you, because you've depended a lot in the book on Christian Barnes's correspondence, which really is a treasure trove
It
of
is, yes.
that should be required reading for anybody who wants to find out about life in this era, in this place. She's not necessarily somebody who thinks slavery is wrong, who speaks in positive terms about people of color. How do you deal with that now in today's world, as a writer, as a historian, as somebody who's writing books that are, I'm sorry, fun to read, but also incredibly smart? Do you quote? Do you cover for them? What's your philosophy about how to deal with these moments when morals don't necessarily agree with our own positions?
I'm so glad you asked about on Christian Barnes, because she is one of these people who is, I think, just absolutely fascinating, and a reminder that people in the past are just as complicated as people in the present, and that we do them a disservice if we try to judge them on, sort of black and white standards of morality or anything else. Because on the one hand, she is someone that I find fascinating and likable, because, again, very rare for anyone to decide they want to encourage a young artist to get trained in London, much less someone's enslaver. And she's very much, besides Daphne and Prince themselves, she's much more so than her husband, a fan of this. And she reaches out to Copley, and Copley's like, I'm not training a black guy, no. And her friends are all making fun of her for it, because they're like, who would let a black man paint their portrait in, Boston? And then, but she perseveres, which I find admirable. And she calls him her Black Hogarth, which, while offensive on the one hand, is also meant to be complimentary. And so that's all admirable, right? That she wants, and she does follow through. She makes sure he gets this training. she also is this sort of interesting proto-feminist. She sort of chafes against domestic restrictions. She says that she wishes she could do more than, just keep house and shop. And I think that's one reason she makes him her protege. And she writes at one point, they're in the mercantile business and they train these young girls to be female shopkeepers. And at one point she writes that she hopes that when they're 18 and they are launched, that they run rings around the young men to prove that girls can do anything boys can do. And so these are not typical 18th century, women's things to say. But on the other hand, you read her letters and, another thing is she wonders what Prince's political point of view is. She's really curious. She hopes that he's a loyalist because he's from their family, but she doesn't know because he hasn't given a hint. And I think the reason he didn't give a hint is that he, of course, is a patriot, as it turns out. And along with he and his mother, there is a third enslaved person in the household called Juliet. And Juliet is a young woman. Kristen Barnes also takes her under her wing, but in a romantic sense, because Juliet and Jack, who's an enslaved man in Marlborough, take up this romance together. And Kristen is charmed by it. She writes that, Jack is so infatuated that he's given up worshiping Bacchus for worshiping Venus. And, that she's encouraging the romance and she allows them to marry, which of course enslaved people can't, but they're given tacit approval to be together. When Juliet becomes pregnant, she has her give birth in one of the best rooms of their house in Marlborough. Daphne is asked to serve as midwife. But then when the baby is born, she writes to a friend, "Sufficient to the day is the evil thereof," and she gives the baby away. Whether she sold it or just gave it away, we don't know. And then when Juliet gets pregnant a second time, and when the baby is born, Kristen Barnes writes, "As we'd feared, the baby's complexion lets us know that Jack is not the father," which to me means that it's the child of a white man. Whether willing or not, we don't know. And, of course, the obvious thing is, was it Henry Barnes? I mean, you don't know, right? These are things you can't answer. But Juliet and Jack wanted to stay together despite this, so I think it was not consensual on Juliet's part. Nevertheless, Kristen Barnes has no sympathy for this, and at this point, she not only sells or gives away the second baby, but she sells Juliet away too. And so I'm like, well, I see why Prince didn't share that he was a patriot with his loyalist family. But at the same time, how do you hold these conflicting things in your hands? Because on the one hand, there's so much to admire about Kristen Barnes. And she's delightful and charming and witty and, but on the other hand, how can you countenance, and I'm a mother, how can you countenance giving people's babies away? That's just shocking. So to me, what I try to do is, even though obviously I have feelings about these things, which I'm sharing with you, I try to show and not tell, because I find, I'm not a minister. People don't want to hear me preach. They'd rather hear me tell a story. So I try to just tell the story, and I feel like the points come out as you tell the story. But I do think that I think it's important to do justice to the complexity of people in the past. And to me, so like John and Abigail Adams are in here as well. George and Martha Washington are in here as well. Paul Revere's in here, but they're sort of side characters, and they come across very differently when they're side characters. And one of the things I love about this is that Abigail Adams does not come off well in this book because, first of all, she visits the Wax Museum in London, and she had been really excited to see the Wax Museum because she writes to her sister when she's sailing to London that the three great American artists are Benjamin West, John Singleton Copley, and Patience Wright. And then she goes to visit the Wax Museum, and she is astonished by the wax figures. In fact, she records, she's embarrassed about this, and I love this because how often is Abigail Adams sort of, left flummoxed? She actually starts to talk to a figure of a clergyman before she realizes that it's not a real person. She's like, even though I knew it was a wax museum, I still got caught. But she's not a fan of Patience Wright. She calls her the queen of sluts. So, Abigail is not, she comes across as sort of judgy when she talks about Patience Wright. And then John Adams is not a fan of wax figures because he says he feels like he's walking through a sea of corpses. But so I love it because John and Abigail Adams, again, I so admire both of them. And I'm so used to talking about Abigail Adams as this, remember the ladies and, corresponding with Mercy Otis Warren and Catherine Macaulay. And instead here I'm like, she's sort of petulant. She's like, she was way too familiar and she's the queen of sluts. So I love that it gives us a different Abigail Adams. So to me, that's part of the fun of it, is to, to do justice to these people in the past and not make them one-dimensional, because I think they're actually more interesting.
Well, I think you've really created whole people in your book,
Thank you.
and they're really both interesting and evocative, and it's a very good read if you haven't read it yet. May I open the floor to questions?
Kind of ironically, if I have the story right, when Franklin went to London, he brought slaves with him, including King,
Yes.
who ran away. So could Prince have self-emancipated?
Yes, and in fact, I do talk about King and his experience in the book, because Benjamin Franklin is a big part of this book as well. And although I think he comes across pretty well. But one of the things that's interesting about this is that Prince could easily have run away because he is connected to both the maritime network, which has a lot of black sailors in it, and also the artistic network, which also has a number of influential black figures in it. So for one example, Ignatius Sancho, who's the famous emancipated man of African descent, who is now known for his music, but was renowned also at the time for his letters and his sort of written observations, but was operating as a shopkeeper. One of the people who used to go ask his opinion about art was John Hamilton Mortimer, who was another person that Robert Edge Pine trained. So we know that Prince was in these direct circles, both on the maritime and the artistic side. And Henry Barnes leaves him alone with the Pines and goes off to Bristol on business. And I think Prince Dima could have easily run away and would have had a good shot, because he's there only the year before the Somerset case is decided in 1772, which of course mandates that if you are an enslaved person and you don't want to be taken away from England to be enslaved in somewhere like Jamaica, you can't be made to physically leave the country. So I think he could have stayed, and he probably would have done okay had he stayed, because he had all these connections. And Pine, by the way, agreed to train him on account of his genius and wouldn't take money for it. So I think he would have actually been probably employable by Pine. And I should mention that his wife was also a portrait painter, Robert Edge Pine's wife, although none of her paintings are known to survive. And at least 2 of his daughters were artists as well. So, but I think the reason he went back was personal ties, because he and his mother were very close, it seems, from Christian Barnes's observations of them. And then when he dies, he leaves everything to what he calls his beloved mother, Daphne Dima. So I think that he went back, much like Sally Hemings later went back from France rather than seeking her freedom, because they have family ties, and they don't want to be sundered from their family by the Atlantic. So it is a really interesting thing to think about, and I do have a chapter on the Somerset case, because it's sort of the bridge between when Prince Dima is there, and then Phyllis Wheatley, interestingly enough, is there right after the Somerset case. But she also chooses to go back because of her attachment to Susanna Wheatley. But she very cleverly is armed with manumission papers, and she leaves a copy in England. So they can't be lost. But yeah, it's intriguing, right? Because I think it's a good reminder that, again, to us, I think it's very easy to think you would do anything to have your freedom, but maybe not if it means leaving your family behind, right? So I did wrestle a lot with this question in the book. Thanks for asking it.
One more question,
I mean, I've looked in the multiple volumes of Franklin letters. Are there
Yes.
letters between them in those letters that Yale has accumulated?
Between Franklin and Wright, Patience Wright?
Any of your
There are a lot between Patience Wright and Benjamin Franklin, and there are a lot between Patience Wright's children, not just Joseph Wright, but also both of her daughters were also helped with wax making. Her daughter Elizabeth went to New York City in the 1780s and set up a very popular wax museum there, which was seen by thousands of people before it went up in smoke, along with Robert Edge Pine's paintings and some of her mother's wax Well, I mean, wax figures are made out of wax softened with turpentine on wooden figures patted out with cloth. It's kind of a recipe for fire disaster.
Sounds like a torch.
It is exactly like a torch, yes. But so she also and her younger sister correspond with Benjamin Franklin. So the whole family is involved in this sort of multi-generational pro-American patriot. One of the things they're doing as well is advocating on behalf of American prisoners of war. There are thousands of American POWs in England and Scotland because there is this Treason Act in place, and they're everywhere from the Tower of London to these purposely built prisons in places like Plymouth where they are not adequately fed or housed, and they resort to doing things like picking snails out of the walls and eating them. And Patience Wright, when she dies, interestingly enough, her obituary not only mentions her wax-making skills, but also her tireless efforts on behalf of American POWs. So it's a really interesting commentary. But Franklin is a very good friend of the Wrights, but you can tell he's simultaneously exasperated and bemused by them because they're all a little extra, I would say, is probably the best word to describe them. I don't know that he corresponded with Robert Edge Pine, but Robert Edge Pine corresponds with George Washington and a number of signers of the Declaration, like the Vaughns and Robert Morris, obviously. So there are a lot of, and then Prince Dima, we don't have correspondence, but he listed in the train, and the second in command there was Paul Revere. So all of these people are part of these they're very within the very Kevin Bacon, 1 degree of separation of all these famous revolutionary people.
May I ask Erica how long you think the new wing will last?
Do you mean what we do that opens next June, how long that one will last?
Yes, because I thought the one that opened 15 years ago was going to be it.
Yes, one
Silly
always
me.
thinks it's going to be it. But, museums shouldn't be static places. And as our understandings of history have changed, as our collection has changed, you'll see a lot of things that we have acquired since 2010, mostly with an effort, frankly, to diversify our collection. I suspect it'll be another 15 or 20 years. It's a kind of generational thing, I would say. But I think it's important to keep these displays fresh and to make them appealing for the community that you're in at any given time. So I hope I won't have to do it a third time, I'll tell you. I think it's going to be great, though. I have to say it is thematic. We have a gallery about Boston in the world. We're going to have a gallery about communities of makers rather than single makers, although we will still have a Copley gallery. We have one about power and resistance and how those ideas are personified in certain objects in the collection. We have one about history and myth-making, which you got a little taste of here. There'll be one about Asia and the Americas. And, we made a commitment in 2010 to be more hemispheric in approach, that it was art of the Americas and not art of the United States. And we've made some great acquisitions with that very much top of mind. So there'll be some new things. I think one of my favorite galleries is the one I'm not working on, because you don't know everything that you wish you had done with one you're not working on. My colleague Noni Gaston and a colleague in the education department are working on a gallery about tea. What about tea, chocolate, mate, and coffee in the 18th century? How are they used? Who used them? Who cared for it? What are the trade implications of drinking those beverages? How many of them need sugar? What is sugar all about? But then also politically. Tea is big in Boston, politically. So, Exactly. So I think these are going to have a layered approach. I think they're going to have things that, even if you don't want me to talk about Copley's technical skill at painting the reflections on a silver teapot, you'll still be able to find something that will, I hope, relate to the world that we're living in now.
Thank you both. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we do have books. If you're interested in the book, Zara will sign it for you.
Yeah.
Dig it out of my bag.
Thank you, though. Those were great questions. So fun.